Hello and welcome. I'm Ross King. This is Renaissance Discoveries, and in this episode we're going to look at libraries in Italy in the 15th century. If you've been faithfully following these videos, and I truly hope you have, you'll have noticed how many of them feature scenes set in libraries. And that's no surprise because libraries were vital to the Italian Renaissance. They were its arsenal, factories staffed by geniuses who took the raw materials of the past and produced luxury goods of and for the intellect. Libraries have always been places of discovery and adventure, and they're always a sign of a vibrant and flourishing culture. But it was during the 15th century in Italy, first of all in Florence, that the modern idea of the library was born, as so often in the 1400s, inspired by ancient examples. Scholars of the 15th century argued that a library could be a public benefit. They decided what books a good one should hold, who should be allowed access to the books, and how these readers should be punished if they lost books or kept them overdue. When we think of the Italian Renaissance, we should therefore think not only of great artists, architects, and sculptors, but also of scribes, scholars, booksellers, librarians, other ink-stained wretches who worked so hard to transmit and preserve knowledge through the repository of great libraries, surely one of the greatest legacies of the Italian Renaissance. But before we start, I have a trivia question for you. Who was the world's first librarian? The answer, at least according to the Greek writer Strabo, who was born in 64 BC, who wrote a treatise on geography, and whose name means squinty, the answer, according to Squinty, was Aristotle. This pub quiz trivia came to light in Florence in 1439 when a scholar from Constantinople brought to the West a copy of Strabo's geography. Florence is one of the few places in Western Europe where this work could have been read in the early 1400s because it was in Greek, and the Florentines, or at least certain distinguished scholars among them, were the few truly competent Greek readers in the West. They were able to read, therefore, about Aristotle's library. According to Strabo, Aristotle was the first man to have collected books and to have taught the kings in Egypt how to arrange a library. That is, Aristotle was the one who showed the Ptolemaic kings who presided over the great library in Alexandria how to classify all of their material. The story is plausible because the library in Alexandria was founded by Alexander the Great, whose teacher was none other than Aristotle. Anyway, back to the 1400s. The first half of the 15th century was an exciting time in Florence. Many ancient manuscripts, lost or unread for centuries, were rediscovered and studied for clues and inspiration as to how society could be improved. This was the time when long-lost works by ancient Roman writers, such as Cicero and Quintilian, were rediscovered in monastery libraries, and when the complete works of Plato, a philosopher largely unknown in the West during the Middle Ages, came to the West for the first time. Many of these ancient works describe the libraries available to scholars in the ancient world and the vast quantities of books that they held, along with their beautiful decorations, such as portrait busts of authors, marble-clad walls, and cypress shelves. Certain princes, scholars, and collectors in 15th century Italy read of these magnificent ancient libraries with awe and dismay. Dismay that they had nothing similar, nothing remotely as grand or useful. The measure of their fall from intellectual and cultural grace since the time of the ancient Greeks and Romans was, it could be argued, their lack of libraries, including public libraries. And so, in order to improve their society, to make their culture great again, they realized that there could be, as one of them wrote, nothing more splendid or more pleasing than a library. The result was that a great many libraries were founded in Italy at this time, including a public library in Florence, the first public library since Antiquity. And one of the greatest libraries of all time, the Vatican Library in Rome, also dates from this time. Through these magnificent collections, knowledge was therefore shared and spread, playing a huge part in making Italy, and especially Florence, the cultural leader of Europe. Another trivia question. Which Roman emperor had the shortest reign? The answer is Gordian II, who ruled for only 3 weeks in the spring of the year 238 before he was killed in battle near Carthage. But Gordian held another, more enviable record, that for the largest library among the Roman emperors. He supposedly had a personal collection of 62,000 books, which, as one ancient historian claimed, raised him to the seventh heaven for being possessed of a library of such magnitude and excellence he became famous among men. The ancient world could boast many great libraries, such as that in Pergamum, which the historian Plutarch claimed held 200,000 works. The greatest library of the ancient world was no doubt that of the Ptolemaic kings in Alexandria, the one founded by Alexander and organized apparently by Aristotle. One writer claimed that this library contained 700,000 works. The size of these libraries was almost unimaginable to people in Italy in the 13 and 1400s. Scholars and collectors at this time could only dream of such quantities and such accessibility. In the Middle Ages, probably the best collection of books in Europe was at the Sorbonne in Paris, whose library in the middle of the 1300s held about 1,700 books. The best stocked medieval monasteries were probably those at Corbie in northern France, with around 800 manuscripts, and Bobbio in northern Italy, with around 650. Meanwhile, the library of the average monastery in the West held far less, only about 60 manuscripts. Western scholars must have wept or gritted their teeth in envy of the ancients. In their copies of Plutarch, they could read how a philosophy-loving Roman general named Lucullus put together a collection of books and made them available to everyone, so that ordinary Romans, as Plutarch wrote, spent the day with one another in glad escape from their other occupations. From Pliny the Elder's Natural History, they learned how in 39 BC, the statesman and historian Asinius Pollio founded a library in the atrium of Liberty on the Aventine Hill, where, as Pliny wrote, he made works of genius the property of the public. In fact, ancient Rome had boasted more than 20 public libraries. They were dotted around its hills and forums, housed in temples and palaces, and you could even find them in the baths. As the poet Ovid wrote, whatever men of old or the present day have conceived in their learned hearts lies open to be inspected by those who wish to read. And it wasn't just in Rome that you could find a public library. The writer Aulus Gellius, who lived in the 2nd century, tells a nice story about how one time he was in Tivoli in the hills outside Rome and got into an argument with someone about whether or not you should eat snow. And so to settle the argument, they went to the local Temple of Hercules, which was, as Gellius writes, well supplied with books. And the pair of them inspected a copy of the writings of Aristotle to find out what he said on the matter. So forget Google. In the 2nd century, you could instantly access Aristotle in a small town 25 miles outside of Rome. And incidentally, Aristotle's advice about eating snow was don't. So there were 20 public libraries in ancient Rome, compared with, in early 15th century Italy as a whole, exactly none, zero. Works of genius were not the property of the public in the early 1400s, but a number of scholars in Florence and elsewhere were inspired by the example of these ancient libraries. And so they went about putting together collections to be made available to the public. Now, the greatest private manuscript collection in Europe at this time was that of the Florentine scholar Niccolo Niccoli, who owned 800 manuscripts. He very generously shared them with friends. He used to invite groups of people to his palazzo, give each of them a manuscript, have them sit down and read in silence, and then, after an hour or two, everyone was encouraged to put his book aside and tell what they had learned. It was a kind of early book club. Niccoli also let people take books out of his palazzo. In effect, he acted in a private capacity as a public library. And when he died in 1437, 200 of his manuscripts were out on loan to friends and scholars. After Niccoli's death, his friends wanted this precious treasure kept together and made available to the public. As one of them, Poggio Bracciolini, said in his funeral oration for Niccoli, "What could be more splendid, more pleasing, more adapted to study, more useful to the city than if a public library could be made, capable of becoming a kind of excellent office of eloquence and of all other good arts?" Luckily, one of Niccoli's other good friends was Cosimo de Medici, the fabulously wealthy banker who was, from 1434 until his death 30 years later, basically the ruler of Florence. Cosimo was a collector of books and a great patron of learning. One scholar wrote that he had a great liking for men of letters. He too wanted to keep Niccoli's collection together and made available to the public. And if Cosimo wanted something done, it usually happened. He acquired Niccoli's collection of manuscripts and donated them to the Dominican monastery of San Marco in Florence, a monastery that he was building with his own personal fortune. Cosimo was known for such generous acts of charity and philanthropy, which he carried out in part to expiate the sin of usury, because much of his money came from making loans at interest. Cosimo decided to found a library in San Marco and stock it with books, beginning with those of Niccoli. He hired his favorite architect, Michelozzo Michelozzi, to begin building a library on the premises. By 1444, the building was complete. It had a magnificent reading room, some 50 yards long and 12 yards wide. Sunlight streamed through 24 windows, with those on the west side overlooking a garden designed by Cosimo himself. The walls were painted green in imitation of the greenish marble, which, as Cosimo knew from reading ancient sources, had clad the walls of libraries in antiquity because the color green refreshed weary eyes. Niccoli's books occupied 2 rows of wooden desks in the library of San Marco, 64 in all, that looked like pews, and that together with the elegant columns, the semicircular arches, and the long central aisle, gave the library the appearance of a church. The surfaces of the desks were tilted like lecterns for the convenience of the readers. Volumes could be borrowed on 6-month loans, and if any of the manuscripts were lost, the friars were obliged to replace them at their own expense within a year. And by 1500, this library held more than 1,200 volumes. Unfortunately, Michelozzo's benches and other furniture disappeared following the suppression of the monasteries and the confiscation of church property by Napoleon after his invasion of Italy in 1797. However, we can get an idea of what everything looked like from another library founded soon after the one at San Marco, one that survives intact, the Biblioteca Testiana in Cesena, which followed the San Marco model very closely. This library was built between 1450 and 52 for Malatesta Novello, the ruler of Cesena, who, like Cosimo at San Marco, paid all the bills himself. Malatesta was a warlord and a soldier, a military strongman who ruled by the sword. It's unclear what exactly inspired him to found a public library beyond Cosimo's efforts in Florence, although in fairness, Malatesta does seem to have been a generous and scholarly character, which was not actually uncommon among warlords in these days. One of the things we repeatedly encounter in the 15th century in Italy are these rulers who combine cultural sophistication with religious piety and the most brutal and ruthless savagery. Anyway, By 1447, Malatesta had developed some kind of infirmity in his leg, a thrombosis or something, that prevented him from going into battle. And he began to devote his time to civic projects such as building a hospital, building a new bridge, and strengthening the city walls. Also, he was lucky enough to have an intelligent and well-educated wife named Violante, to whom much of the credit for the library should probably be given. The available space was slightly smaller than that at San Marco, with room for only 29 benches on each side. And this is where, rather than on shelves, the books were kept. You moved around the library according to what manuscript you wanted to read. You went to the books rather than them coming to you, because, as you can see, many of the books are attached to the benches by chains to make sure that they don't go walkabout. A scriptorium for copying manuscripts was set up in the Malatesta library, and whole flocks of sheep were allocated to provide the parchment for them. By the time of Malatesta Novello's death in 1465, the library contained some 200 volumes. If the Library of San Marco was in a Dominican convent, this one in Cesena was a civic institution. The local Franciscans were the guardians, and the library was built on the property of their convent. However, the building and its manuscripts were the property not of the friars, nor even of the Malatesta family, but rather of the city and people of Cesena. Therefore, they were public property, which meant that Napoleon couldn't get his hot little hands on them and pillage and destroy this library like he did the one at San Marco. When Cosimo decided to bankroll a library, he needed to know what books should be included. One of the people who advised him on the books a good library should hold was a great scholar and book collector named Tommaso Parentuccelli. Parentuccelli very helpfully drew up a list for Cosimo, one that included religious works by Christian writers such as Jerome and Augustine, philosophical treatises by classical authors, books on science and mathematics, and also ones on literature and the humanities. Interestingly and fortunately, in 1447, Parentuccelli got an important job. He got himself elected Pope, Pope Nicholas V, known as the first Renaissance Pope. And it was only to be expected that when Parentuccelli became Pope, he would use the papacy and his own considerable personal collection to establish a library in Rome, what became the Vatican Library. In the Middle Ages, the popes had collected books, putting together a library of perhaps around 500 manuscripts, but these had largely been dispersed in the decades after the removal of the papacy to Avignon in 1309, the so-called Babylonian captivity of the papacy, when it abandoned Rome for some 7 decades. Nicholas therefore took it upon himself to refound and endow the new Vatican collection. He provided a space for the library, converting what had been a storehouse for grain into a 2-room library that he ultimately stocked with more than 1,000 volumes, 353 of which were in Greek. He built up the collection by commissioning copies and translations of numerous classical authors, including Homer, one of his favorite authors. This library, like those in Florence and Cesena, was public, open to scholars, all of which made Rome, for the first time in more than 1,000 years, a place of scholarship and culture. Nicholas died in 1455, and the Vatican Library wouldn't get much further help until Pope Sixtus IV was elected in 1471 and decided to expand it. In December of that year, he ordered 5 architects to quarry and transport to the Vatican a supply of stone for use in a certain building to be constructed for library purposes. In 1475, Sixtus issued a bull officially founding the Vatican Library, dedicating funds towards it and naming a scholar, Bartolomeo Platina, as the librarian. And the library was decorated with this fresco showing that very appointment, with Platina on his knees before the Pope, pointing at an inscription that he composed for the occasion. Platino also composed something else, his rules for the library. Among other things, they stated, "No one shall converse angrily with another and make a disturbance in the library, nor clamber over the seats and wear them away with his feet in moving from place to place. The reader shall close the books and return them to the proper place. He who acts otherwise shall be ignominiously expelled and henceforth prevented from entering here." An even worse fate awaited anyone who borrowed a book without returning it. Sixtus issued a bull stating that anyone who failed to return a book from the Vatican Library 40 days after the overdue notice was issued would be excommunicated. So what sort of manuscripts were being collected for and preserved in the Vatican Library? In fact, they were very similar to the sorts of books being collected in the libraries in Florence and Cesena. There were a lot of ecclesiastical works, books on canon law and so forth, as you would expect. But there was also a huge amount of classical literature, the writings of the Latin and Greek poets, along with ancient Roman writings on history, geometry, and astrology, Greek works on medicine, etc., etc. Because Sixtus claimed that the library was meant both for the exaltation of Christianity and the advancement of learning in general. And this mixture of the sacred with the profane, of saints and martyrs with pagan philosophers and scientists, was typical of these Renaissance libraries. One of the other great collections in Italy was put together roughly the same time that Sixtus was stocking the Vatican Library, that is, in the 1470s. And that was the library of Federico da Montefeltro, the Duke of Urbino. Like Malatesta Novello, who was his brother-in-law, Federico was first and foremost a soldier. In fact, he was the greatest soldier in Italy. But he was also a man of considerable learning. He employed 5 servants at his court whose sole duty was to read to him in his moments of leisure. And in fact, during his few moments of recreation on military campaigns, he liked nothing better than to sit in his tent and to have works of Roman history read to him. We see him here in this painting wearing his suit of armor as he casts his one good eye. He lost his right eye in a joust when he disdained a helmet. He casts his one good eye over the beautiful velvet-clad manuscript created for his library by the great Florentine manuscript dealer Vespasiano da Bisticci. Vespasiano was the one who organized this library for Federico, which Vespasiano called the greatest library since Antiquity. Vespasiano had vast experience stocking libraries. He was essential to this project of library building in Italy, and indeed well beyond Italy. He had clients all across Europe. He worked for Cosimo de Medici, for example. In the 1460s, he organized a library from scratch on the outskirts of Florence, that at the Badia or Abbey of the Augustinians in Fiesole. As at San Marco, Cosimo was the patron, the man who bankrolled the building and the stocking of the library. And as at San Marco, Cosimo wanted the collection in Fiesole to be open to the public. He envisaged that this collection would serve not only the resident Augustinians, but also the wider community of scholars, or what he called good and learned men. Vespasiano went to work at the request of Cosimo, producing some 200 manuscripts in the space of 22 months, using a team of 45 scribes. Vespasiano produced even more manuscripts for the library in Urbino, roughly 900 of them. The library was found on the ground floor of the new palace's north wing. The collection included not only Greek, Latin, and Hebrew works, but also more modern writings by authors such as Dante and Petrarch. And all of them were bound in scarlet and decorated with jewels and rich silver fittings, adorned and bound with wondrous beauty, according to Federico's resident painter and poet, Giovanni Santi. Santi was the father of Raphael. Distinguished visitors were allowed to feast their eyes on the collection. I've seen men of the finest taste lost in wonder before them, wrote Santi. However, Federico's librarian observed strict instructions to keep at bay the inepti e ignoranti, immundi e stomacosi, anyone who was foolish, ignorant, filthy, or angry. But the sad fact is that foolish, ignorant, filthy, and angry people often did turn up in these libraries, not to read books, but to pillage or burn them. Cesare Borgia invaded Urbino in 1502, and his thugs tore the jewels from the bindings. Fortunately, most of the manuscripts from Urbino survived this looting, and they're now safe in the Vatican Library. But this sort of Philistine thuggery haunted the minds of the scholars and collectors in the 15th century. They knew from their readings and also from bitter experience just how fragile knowledge could be, how it could fall victim to fire, war, vandalism, and even, of course, time itself. They knew, for example, that the great library in Alexandria had been partially destroyed by Julius Caesar's siege of the city in 48 BC. So knowledge needed to be safeguarded through reproduction, through the copying of one manuscript from another. But this was a slow and painstaking business, even when undertaken by someone with the resources of Vespasiano da Bisticci. And so we can appreciate how scholars in Italy were excited when they learned of a machine that could almost magically reproduce works in hundreds or even thousands of copies. And that was, of course, the printing press, a machine that would allow libraries and their collections to grow enormously, exponentially in the decades and centuries that followed its invention by Johannes Gutenberg in the 1450s, ensuring that knowledge could be transmitted and preserved. But that is another story, although one which luckily I tell in my video on the Renaissance discovery of the printing press. These days, the Vatican Library holds 75,000 manuscripts and a whopping 1.1 million printed books, a great legacy of and testament to Nicholas V, Sixtus IV, Platina, and all of the scribes, scholars, and ink-stained wretches who dreamed of assembling the world's greatest knowledge. Thank you so much for watching. Please watch more of my videos. Please subscribe. And please, if you want to know more about some of the princes and strongmen in Europe who wish to use books to burnish their reputations for wisdom and culture, or to offset their reputations for murderous savagery, I highly recommend my most recent book, The Bookseller of Florence, available in your favorite bookshop or in your local library.